Hi, my name is Michael Chikeen. The smartest people I've met have one common belief, that us silly humans really don't know much. For example, we still don't know why planes stay in the air, or how Tylenol or even gravity works. Yeah, gravity. Look it up. In today's distracted, clickbait, misinformation age, I wish we could all be less certain, more humble, and a lot more curious. Admittedly, I've been known to struggle with all three. So no more, no less, this show is my attempt to be that change. Thanks for joining me, and here we go. Hey everybody, welcome back to No More, No Less. I'm your host, Michael Chikeen, and today in the virtual studio, I have with me Dr. Ronald F. Levant. Is it Levant or Levant?
Levant.
Levant. So Dr. Levant is Professor Emeritus of Psychology at the University of Akron, Ohio. He's the past president of the American Psychological Association, the APA, and also the APA's Division 51, which is the Society for Psychological Study of Men and Masculinities. He's widely considered one of the key people responsible for creating this new field of psychology of men and masculinities, and he was included in the Elsevier Stanford University database listing the top 2% of scientists in the world. So when it comes to studying men and masculinities and manhood and everything involved, he's kind of a big deal. So today we're going to be discussing his recent book titled The Tough Standard, The Hard Truths About Masculinity and Violence. So we've got a lot to unpack, so let's get into it. Dr. Levant, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Michael. I'm glad to be on your show.
I think the first thing I'd want to start in, because it seems many of your books and research over the last decade or longer has been devoted to, men, manhood, and everything around it. And so I'd like to know how you found yourself researching that and how it became such a big part of your life.
Sure. It actually goes back to the 80s, so quite a ways.
Mm-hmm.
And my initial job as a professor was at Boston University.
Okay.
And my research program at the time was focused on parenting. And typically the way professors like me work is we work with doctoral students who kind of do dissertations in our area, and it extends our research program. So I had, half a dozen dissertations in the area of parenting. And at the same time, in my personal life, I was a divorced, semi-custodial daughter of a pre-teenage daughter who lived with me in the summers, and I visited her with her mother, living with her mother in New York during the academic year. And I really was not satisfied with myself as a father. I felt I just wasn't doing a very good job as a dad. I myself did not have a very good role model in my own father, and we can talk about that. I saw this movie that came out in 1979, Kramer versus Kramer.
Yeah, I heard of it.
Yeah, this is a movie about a breakup. Dustin Hoffman and Meryl Streep, they play the Kramers, whose divorce is breaking up. Mrs. Kramer, as was typical of the time, said, "I'm going to California to find myself."
Right.
That was a thing back then.
Right.
And Mr. Kramer was left as the sole parent for his 8-year-old son. And boy, did he make a mess of things. And I saw myself in him, and I had kind of a slow-moving epiphany that maybe it wasn't just that Ron Levant was a pretty weak father, but that men of my generation, the boomers, had not really been prepared for this involved parenting role, basically of being the only parent on deck, as it were. And so I started reading the research literature, and I couldn't find any studies that included men as parents in any evaluations of parent training programs.
Wow.
It was all women, all mothers. They were a forgotten parent. And so I decided, and I was working with a doctoral student, Greg Doyle at the time. He and I were training for the Boston Marathon, so we had a lot of time to talk on those 10 and 15 mile runs, right?
Sure.
So he needed a topic, and I said, why don't you develop a parent education program for dads and evaluate its effects for your dissertation? So that's what happened. He and I worked on it together, as is typical in doctoral programs, and we developed this program, essentially providing men with the skills that women get, as kind of a matter of education and socialization,
Right.
to be able to be primary caregivers. And it turned out, our timing couldn't have been better. Because this was like 1982 and 1983. And you were just starting to see evidence of the father's role changing. You had men holding infants in snuggly packs or pushing strollers. So it was just visible. So we just got in on the cusp of it, and we offered this program to the community. Boston University at that time wanted some community serving programs that were, not for academic credit, but just a service. So I was given an opportunity to get release time and to set up this program to offer parent education for fathers to the community. And we were just bowled over. We put an ad in the public service section of the Boston Globe and the local NPR station.
All right.
And we just started getting calls. And so we started working with men with this program. And through that, I can go into more details, but, not only do we develop a way of helping men become involved fathers, but I also opened up some clues that led to the psychology of men and masculinity. We can talk more about that.
Wow. Yeah, that's great. I appreciate that primer of foundation, because I think, I'm working on a project that's kind of tangential to this as well. And the things I'll read is that, like, it seems men in this iteration of manhood right now are kind of starved for community. You have a lot of people, unfortunately, some unfortunate personalities that are all telling men what they should be, how to be, and all these things. But there's not really a lot of men just coming together as community to help themselves, just to be better overall people. And so it's great to hear that, when you grant that outlet in whatever, people were calling and saying, like, yeah, I could use this. And I think part of it, at least in what I've been reading lately, is that, and we've had a prior conversation of this, is that it kind of all starts with boys and how we treat boys and how we think boys are inside this giant man box that's kind of impossible to fill for any of us. And so to start diving into your Tough Standard book, I think a lot of people, if we're asked, like, are men prone to violence or are men violent, I think most people would probably say yes, because, as we've discussed, most violent crime, homicide, all these things are perpetrated by men, but that doesn't mean that men themselves are violent. And so I want to start with one of the more pernicious myths around this, that testosterone is responsible for violence in men. And I know your book touches on that myth, and I was hoping you could get into that a bit.
Sure. Well, I'm a psychologist, not a biologist, so I didn't really give a full biological treatment of
Sure.
of the male sex, but I did have to consider testosterone. And so I looked into the literature on it, and I found out the following set of facts. First of all, testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone circulate in the bodies of all humans, irrespective of their sex. So we all have all of these hormones. Secondly, there's no dose-response relationship. So although aggression depends to some extent on the presence of testosterone, and this is for people of any sex, more testosterone does not mean more aggression. And they've done this in studies with non-human animals, where they've given 20 times the baseline dose with no increase in aggression.
Wow.
So obviously, aggression varies from mild to extreme, but testosterone does not cause that variation. And then the third fact is that among non-human animals, social factors appear to be more powerful in influencing whether there is or is not aggression than any biological factor. So take chimpanzees, which are known to be quite aggressive, particularly when the alpha male, the dominant male, is challenged. There could be a fight, there could be a murder, but once that's settled, there's no aggression in the chimpanzee colony. So the social fact of establishing a dominance hierarchy overrides whatever biological factors might be. So, I do think that it's important to keep all that in mind when we talk about aggression.
Right. And so what do you think could account for more of a violent factor in men? Does it start when boys hit adolescence, or I know that there is a factor for how we treat boys and kind of narrow the bandwidth of emotion that we allow them to have. I know I read some studies where if girls are emoting either sadness or betrayal or confusion and all these things, anxiety, they're mirrored by their caregivers, the emotions that they're having. Whereas if boys have the same emotions, excuse me, then they're treated as if they're angry. So I was wondering if you could shed some light on where you think some of this aggression might come from otherwise.
Okay. Well, let me actually back up and make a kind of first a general point. It goes back to something you mentioned earlier, Michael, and that is that when it comes to, let's say, gun violence, well over 90%, depending on the specific statistic you're looking at, I've seen as high as 97%, of gun violent crimes is committed by boys and men. There was recently a mass shooting committed by a transgender woman,
right.
And it made a lot of news because it wasn't a male.
Right.
Okay. And but the second fact is that the vast majority of boys and men would never pick up a gun, other than in self-defense and shoot someone. That well over 90% of boys and men are not gun violent. So you have these, lopsided facts, and the question is, what aspect of being male predisposes a small minority of men to be extremely violent? And that's what I have been working on, both in the book and in a subsequent study that I did. And I do have an answer, but I'll wait for you to respond.
Right. Yeah, that's great. I'd love to hear exactly what from the evidence that you found from the literature is, because I think even when you say a very small amount of men are violent, I can already hear, some people saying, but there are just so many men that have murdered people, and they're like, but we have to compare to the entire gender from the whole planet. Like this is really a small subset of men, and you have to think of if all the other men are going through this experience of manhood and masculinity and struggling with what that means. I think we see other outcomes in societies like the suicide rate from men to women is 4-1, substance abuse, like all of these things that you see men are struggling with, and some cope fairly well, but I think the ones that end up being more isolated, or the ones that perhaps are isolated and have trauma from growing up, who knows what that can mean in this day and age. But I'd love to hear what you found reading into the literature on this.
Sure, and I'm glad to tell you about that. So first of all, for this study, I did something different. Typically, social sciences tend to be siloed in the sense that psychologists read psychology journals and sociologists read sociology journals and so on and so forth. But I went outside of my comfort zone and read sociology, cultural anthropology, criminology, social work, as well as psychology in my review of the literature. And what I found was, first of all, even though the terminology differed, as it will, between different scientific disciplines, and although the methods differ, psychology tends to be more quantitative, the other disciplines tend to be more qualitative.
Okay.
The overriding finding was this, that men who feel that their masculinity has been threatened are more prone to act aggressively. Okay?
Wow.
Now, we can't study actual violence in the psych laboratory. I mean, obviously, you'd never get IRB approval for a study that caused violence. It would be unethical.
Right.
So we, in the studies that I reviewed, again, from all these disciplines, they use proxies of violence. These the most direct would be like self-report of prior violence. But self-report, is not the best thing, because people always like to portray themselves in the best way, and sometimes they distort, their own history. So, but self-report, also using scales that measure indicators of violence, like there's an aggression scale, there's hostility scales.
Right.
And then having some simulation of violence in the actual experiment, like shocking in air quotes a supposed Confederate. Psychologists do this a lot, where they set up an experiment where somebody will supposedly receive shocks. And that person is thought to be another participant, whereas that person actually is a Confederate of the experimenter, and they will fake being shocked to see, just as part of the protocol.
Oh, that makes more sense. When you said Confederate, I'm like, was this done in the Civil War? What are we talking? What are we talking about here?
No, not the Confederate Army, but
right.
A collaborator, let's say, of
the
experiment. So I'll give you one example of an experimental study that is quite important in this regard. Basically, they got a large group of men and randomly assigned them to a treatment and to a control group, or experimental and a control group.
Okay.
The experimental group was asked to braid the hair on a mannequin doll and put in pink ribbons. The control group was asked to braid rope to make it stronger. At the end of the task, both groups were given the opportunity to either sit quietly in a room or punch a punching bag. Who do you think chose more often to punch the punching bag?
No way. It's that simple? Wow. What was it? I guess it must have been statistically significant.
Oh yeah, I don't have the exact numbers at hand, but yeah, it was.
See,
difference.
This stuff really drives me crazy, because the more I read about it, the more I learn how much we really do put on the shoulders of boys with this idea that homosexuality is bad or anything feminine is bad, and I think it detaches them from themselves, because it becomes like this. And please correct me where you disagree, but to me it seems like it teaches boys to never accept themselves. So if there's no self-acceptance, it becomes more self-loathing, And then it's hard to understand not only how to give love, but also how to receive love. Because if how to give love means being feminine, well, then that's off the table. And then if you want to give love, but that's also feminine, then that's off the table. So I was reading the book Deep Secrets about connections between boys by Dr. Niobe Way. I think she's at NYU. And it's really incredible how these boys speak about their friendships with each other, but how it changes as they get older, because some are clearly resisting these masculine norms, but I guess it depends on the community you have around you, like how many of your friends are also trying to resist these norms, or your parents. Let's say you come from a very conservative religious household that believes that Adam and Eve and all of these and all of these things. Like, are these the things that you're finding as well? Like, just this concept of masculinity is like a 1,000-pound weight on the psyche of men?
Wow, that's a great way to describe it. Yes. Basically, I think even today, 2023, most boys, and I'm talking young boys, elementary, preschool, are made to feel that conforming to these masculine norms is obligatory. They are told that the worst thing that they can do is walk, talk, act, or throw like a girl.
Right.
So masculinity becomes the opposite of anything feminine. And as you pointed out, some important human qualities like empathy, like compassion, like the expression of love verbally, as opposed to physically, and so on, are defined as feminine.
Right.
And the obligation for many boys is enforced violently. That is, boys get beaten up for displaying feminine qualities.
Yeah.
And that was the case when I was a boy back in the 40s, and it's still the case now in 2023. I have literature that shows that, not my own studies, but other people's studies.
Right.
So it's still going on, and you think about what does that do, to a child. What it does is it creates a deep reservoir of shame that is easily stimulated, as in that simple study that I mentioned where they had to, do something feminine, put in ribbons and braid hair.
Right.
That causes them that they have to demonstrate very powerfully that they're masculine, like punching that punching bag, right?
Right.
So this kind of provides the foundation for understanding why it is that threatened masculinity, seems to be the ingredient that causes a small minority of men to get gun violent. Now, I have more evidence that bears on that point, because, as I said, none of the experiments or surveys that I reviewed actually studied real violence, but I found 3 sources of actual gun violence. One is a database of school shooters. It was put together by Peter Langman, and it's searchable. And the other were 2 qualitative studies, one of murder-suicides and the other of mass shooters. Now, these categories overlap. Like Columbine was all 3. It was a school shooter, a mass shooter, and a murder-suicide. But what I found in the school shooter database and the 2 qualitative studies was exactly the same thing. That and these are examinations of actual perpetrators, like Adam Lanza from Sandy Hook, the Sandy Hook Elementary. And what they found was exactly the same thing, that it is threatened masculinity that caused these boys to engage in these heinous acts. And here's a further data point. Wow. If that isn't enough, did we talk about the Remington settlement?
I believe so. We touched on it. Yeah, I'd love for you to explain that.
Yeah, so Remington is a armaments manufacturer. It's actually out of business now, but at the time it made the AR-15 a rifle. It called it the Bushmaster.
Right.
And the parents and survivors of Sandy Hook, we just mentioned Sandy Hook, sued Remington and won a settlement of $73 million. So, and that was, as I said, the company's out of business. It was paid by their insurance companies,
Right.
or is to be paid. I'm not sure it actually has been paid. And why did they win this settlement? Because of the way Remington advertised its weapon. I think I showed you a picture of it, and basically what it is a picture of the weapon, kind of longitudinally across this, going horizontally across the screen, and a symbol of the, I guess it's the logo, which looks like some sort of snake.
Yeah.
And then the caption, which is the most important part, says your man card reissued.
Right. That makes me super angry because even the idea in that ad is that for people who already feel like they're not enough of a man, of whatever that means, then they're going to read that ad and think that this is the only way for me to be a man. I'm going to have to get this gun and shoot something. And I think it seems like this aggression has to come from this area where they feel like there's so much weight on them in the world to prove themselves as a man. Maybe they are just gay, or maybe they're just sensitive, or maybe they're just a human being. And so they feel like they can't live up to this idea of manhood. And so if your emotions and empathy is taken away from you, if you can't even feel or recognize sadness. So the only way that emotion is going to mechanize within your body is going to be aggression. And then there's monsters like Remington that are really harnessing that, or even today, like people like Andrew Tate or Jordan Peterson to some extent as well, that is like harnessing all of that, anger and loneliness and isolation to their own means. And it's disgusting, where I think we just need to be able to help men and boys accept themselves for who they are, and whatever that means. I'm not talking about the LGBT community, just that you're a human being and you can feel however you want to feel.
Well, let's talk about feelings, because that's, I think, central to what you're talking about.
Sure.
One of the consequences of socializing boys to believe that conforming to masculine norms is obligatory has to do with one specific norm, and that is the norm to restrict the expression of vulnerable and caring emotions. So vulnerable emotions are emotions that make you feel vulnerable, like fear and sadness, and caring and attachment emotions are those that express fondness or need for another person, or even loneliness because you don't have that other person. So, these emotions are essentially off limits to boys, and as a result, boys have a greater chance of growing up to be men who are genuinely unaware of their emotional life.
Right.
There's a clinical term for this, is Alexithymia, Alexithymia, that literally means without words for emotions.
Right.
And my research has shown over, going back to the 90s now, that first of all, men meet, there's a scale for this and cutoffs and all that kind of stuff. So I did a meta-analysis, which is a statistical aggregation of a number of studies that used this alexithymia scale, comparing men and women, and found that men meet criteria for alexithymia more frequently than women. But like most psychological characteristics that are compared between sexes, the difference was small. Most most psychological characteristics are not that different between men and women.
Right.
If you think of a distribution of scores, say on an aggression scale, and you measure men and women, you'll get two overlapping distributions with small differences at the center and the mean, but vast areas of overlap.
Right. So if the results, if the difference between them is so small, then what are the implications about this?
Well, it means that more men than women would meet criteria for alexithymia. How many more? We don't know.
Right.
And we don't have prevalence data. I wish we did, but we don't. But I'll tell you anecdotally, every time I give a talk, to a group, I'll often ask, how many? If you know a man who cannot tell you what he's feeling, raise your hand. And almost all the people in the room raise their hands.
Right.
So anecdotally, but we don't have good scientific data to say how many. So what are the implications of this? If you can't even identify your emotions, if like you're asked to say how you feel, and all you can do is describe the physiological component of emotion, like say, I feel like I've got butterflies in my stomach, or a tight band across my forehead, or something like that.
Right.
But you can't say that I feel afraid or I feel hurt.
Right. So it's more how their emotion is presenting in the body as more of like a, let's say, a physical ailment than it would be the emotional life that might be causing this. So if it's anxiety, it's like, oh, I feel like my heart's racing, or but it wouldn't be like, oh, I'm just anxious.
Exactly.
That's really interesting. Or even not too long ago, I was speaking with a friend, and we were just chatting about relationships, etc. And with his girlfriend, they live together, and they were going through a bit of a rough patch at the time. And I was just asking him, as things were getting a little better, I'm like, well, do you feel like you have enough connection in the relationship? Like, is that part okay? And he answered me with like, yeah, we're still having, sex pretty regularly. And I didn't think about it at the time, like honestly, until after the conversation a couple of days later, when I was like, oh, that's not even the question I asked. Right? Like, because even in the moment, I was thinking more of like, do you guys hold hands when you go out? Do you have conversations about your relationship? Do you feel like you guys are in love? That's the implied sentiment I had with, do you feel connected? But his interpretation was, are they being physically intimate? And I think that speaks to your point as far as men having a hard time identifying these emotions, because even going back to what you said about, the boomer generation, especially those that maybe were coming from countries immigrating to North America, there really wasn't bandwidth in their lives for feelings, for asking the children how they felt. Like, the idea was just like, we need to go to work, we need to make sure these kids are fed, sleep, and don't die. And then that's kind of like, that was the quota. But I think now people are waking up in their 30s, 40s, 50s, children of these generations, thinking like, oh, wait a minute, there was a lot of my inner world that was ignored, and now I wasn't really sure now how to kind of identify these emotions. Are you seeing that in a lot of the men that you're speaking with now as well?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I think when we last talked, I mentioned a client of mine who, a psychotherapy client. I'm a psychologist, both academically and clinically.
Okay.
And at the time, I had a private practice, which I've closed since then. But this particular man said his wife was complaining about the lack of intimacy. She wanted more intimacy in their relationship. And he says, well, what does she want me to do? Rip her clothes off when she comes in the door and make love to her in the foyer?
Right.
The idea that you could experience intimacy through conversation had never occurred to him.
Right.
So absolutely, it impairs relationships. If you cannot put your emotional experience into words, you will be handicapped in all but the most superficial relationships. But it goes even further than that. It has to do with how we humans deal with stress. I mean, stress is part of life.
Right.
And and stress varies from minor hassles to major traumas. The most effective means known to deal with stress is to talk about your experience with a trusted other person, and in that conversation receive some empathy, some understanding, maybe see things from a different perspective, and maybe even cry, because it felt so bad.
Right.
And as a result, you kind of feel better about yourself and you move on. And if men can't do anything other than say, I've got butterflies in my stomach, and not say that I'm anxious, they're going to be handicapped in how they deal with stress. And that relates to a couple of other points you mentioned earlier. Stress is unpleasant. It doesn't feel good. And so if you can't kind of talk about it, you may want to drown it out with alcohol.
Right.
So,
tip of the iceberg, I guess, for all the things that you could drown it out with. Like, alcohol is like the starting point, and then we could probably name 10 more things that are detrimental that men could use to self-medicate.
Exactly. And then it shows up in the epidemiological statistics that you mentioned, that men meet criteria for substance use disorder 4 times as frequently as women. And, as you can say, we can go on and on. Gambling, porn.
Right.
And most importantly, aggression. Aggression is a way to dispel bad feelings.
Right.
There are men who, when they're feeling bad, they go to a bar room and try to start a fight. I've known them. I've known those men. When I was a young man.
Because I think if men are like trying to grapple with the weight of what they think they need to be, or what maybe they aren't, or whatever the case may be, if there is no outlet, like the way I like to look at it is like it's like steam in a pot, that at some point either someone's going to take the lid off to let some steam out, or it's going to blow, or it's going to find some sort of crack in the functionality of that kettle just to get out. And let's say you block off everything inside. Like, I think it becomes more of like the steam building inside you, and then maybe that turns to self-harm or substance abuse, or eventually someone takes it out on their partner. And I think, just so we can be clear to any women listening, I think we, like you say, like this also can happen to women as well, that were perhaps raised in environments where they couldn't have negative emotions and they don't know how to collaborate with their partners. Like, it creates another side of relationship dysfunction. But for the purpose of this conversation, your expertise, we're focusing on men. I just didn't want to make it seem like we're saying that this never happens to women at all.
Right. Yeah, well, masculinity is not the same thing as being male. It's it's really a set of gender norms that people conform to, and scholars have written about female masculinity. So
interesting.
Women who enact masculine traits. So it's
actually, if I can interject for a second on something you mentioned, because one of the questions I wanted to ask you is about like how we can unravel men from the humans, and masculinity, like, because men and masculinity isn't the same thing, and there are a lot of coaches online these days trying to teach men how to have a more feminine side and women how to have a more masculine side, and this stuff drives me crazy. like we're all humans, and so if a woman decides that she wants to learn to be more, let's say, decisive, or a leader, or let's say physically strong, like, this isn't teaching her how to be masculine. She can just learn those traits. And in men, if we tell men that they should learn to embrace their feminine side, you have to undo all the psychology that they've gone through their entire life that tells them everything about them should not be feminine. Like that's what their thing is. And I think like, so there's all this self-loathing. So how do you think that we can unravel at, you know, either on the boys' side or the men's side, the men, the humans, you know, away from this concept of masculinity?
Well, the way I do it, and I have done it as a clinical psychologist, is really not use those terms, masculine and feminine, but talk about, you know, how children are socialized.
Okay.
Yeah, and because you know, it's clear that we you know, children are socialized in various ways, and one of the ways that they're socialized is in conforming to gender roles. And you know, boys and girls are punished for violating traditional gender roles, and they're reinforced for not. But that leaves a lasting effect. So I'll give you an anecdote that illustrates this for women. I was an undergraduate at Berkeley in the 60s, and I know what everybody says about Berkeley in the 60s.
That it was fun, that it was very fun.
That, and if you can remember it, you weren't there.
Right. That's great.
But I can remember, and I was there. And what I do remember, because the feminist movement was just, you know, the second wave feminism was just getting started. I remember women. I was involved in the New Left and those kind of activities. I knew a lot of women who were feminists. And what they were doing is they were taking assertiveness training classes to overcome the effects of their socialization to be dependent on and deferent to men.
No way.
Absolutely.
And I love that they didn't call it like masculine training courses. Like, can you imagine that? Can you imagine women fighting against, at that point, which was like an oppressive patriarchal society, which we still have, but it obviously was so much worse, 60 years ago. And then they're going to take a course about how to be a man. You're like, hold on, we're not trying to do this. And so like, that's what we're doing to men now. That's saying like, listen, take this course and be more feminine. Like, no wonder most guys don't want to do that. But if it's like, listen, how can you have better connections with the people you love? How can you show the people you love that you love them? Like, I think that these messages would be better. And like,
absolutely, I completely agree. I've been working recently with some corporate consultants. I have a psychotherapeutic intervention for working with men who cannot put their emotions into words. It's called Alexithymia reduction treatment, or ART, and it's a manualized treatment, and you can work it into any kind of therapy. And we were talking about adapting it to people who aspire to the C-suite, you know, the highest level of corporate executives, because
right.
What their research showed is one of the most important characteristics of successful executives who make it into the C-suite is their emotional intelligence. And so we were talking about applying my alexithymia reduction treatment to the corporate sector. But, you know, so if you basically talk to men about emotional intelligence and becoming more emotionally self-aware rather than becoming more feminine, and if it's particularly in this case where it's linked to career prospects, I think men will grab it up. And we had that kind of experience when we were doing this.
That's an interesting turn on it as well, because I think the men that I've been speaking to about this topic, even outside of like men's groups that I've joined, just friends and people I've met, like there's no one that this doesn't resonate with. Like the idea that, you know, men can be more isolated and they do want to have better connections, and not just connections based on business or things like that. They want to have real friendships like they had when they were boys, most of them, and anyhow. But I think you don't know who to ask. I think if you ask some of your friends, but the friends you ask end up ascribing more to these traditional masculine traits, well, then they're going to give you a whole heaping spoonful of shit for asking a question like that. And then it's kind of like this, then that guy who was curious no longer wants to ask these questions, and he's stuck again. So it's like, I hope we can create more outlets, because that alexithymia reduction training, which like you said, I think we need a better marketing title for that. But but it sounds great actually. For the research I discussed with you that I'm doing, I'd love if you could send me that. I don't believe you sent me that reduction protocol.
I don't actually, I can't actually distribute it because I'm doing it as a book, and I used to, but the publisher asked me not to distribute it. But I'll send you an article about it.
Okay, yeah, that would be great. And so I guess, because I want to be respectful of your time, I believe we have about 10 minutes. As for the central core of the tough standard and actually a lot of your work, is there anything specific that you'd want to discuss to kind of round out our chat here for the benefit of men that are suffering, or maybe men that are, men and women that are attempting to raise boys in this world?
Yeah, I do. So going back to second wave feminism, back in the 60s, as a result of second wave feminism, women dramatically changed their status in society. In the 50s, women couldn't sign a legal contract. They couldn't buy a dishwasher on their own. And most women in the 50s and early 60s were homemakers. If you want to see what life was like back then, if you go to YouTube and look up Leave It to Beaver or Father Knows Best, you can see what I mean.
Right.
And but something started happening in the 60s. The women's movement got going. Ms. Magazine, the Feminine Mystique book came out, and women started entering the workforce. And so between, say, about 1955 and 1985, women dramatically entered, almost like a tidal wave, to the point that 50% of mothers of small children by 1985 were employed.
Wow.
What that did is that gave women financial independence. And so it's no accident that the next thing that happened, starting in 65 and going up to about 85, was what's referred to as the divorce revolution, where divorces started multiplying to the point that half of all divorces were going to end in divorce. So, and two-thirds of those divorces were initiated by the women.
Yeah.
So once
because they didn't have those financial chains anymore and barriers, and so they can kind of, not to sound so medieval, but they could kind of buy their own freedom.
Yeah, I mean, basically they could get out of bad marriages. They could, live more of a life. And during that whole period, the latter part of the 20th century, there were just millions of intergenerational conversations between adult women and girls about how to navigate gender relations in this changed social environment. So nowadays we have Richard Reeves' book about how bad men are doing compared to girls and women, and those are all true.
Yeah.
But Reeves misses the fundamental point, is that nothing like that occurred for boys. Boys, even to this day, are expected to suck it up and be a man.
Right.
And nothing about, be a human, damn it.
Right.
Nothing about that. Nothing about breaking down those crazy man box barriers that you cannot express compassion to another human being. You cannot receive empathy from a person, and just trying to get rid of all that. That hasn't happened, and that is what has to happen.
Right.
I think boys and men, will only do well. And I think the central part of it is, since, this does seem to be a problem, is helping boys and men learn how to put their emotions into words.
Right. Yeah, that's great because I did read that book by Richard Reeves, and it was a great book. A little bit too academic sometimes with all the great stats he has packed in there, and he's doing the podcast circuit now as well. But I think you're right. Like that's the one component that a lot of men are missing, to have this idea that you can just be a human being. You don't have to be all of these things in this man box. I think he's a tech entrepreneur, and he's a professor as well, Scott Galloway. I don't know if you heard of Scott.
I've heard of the name. I don't know
Right, and
exactly
he has
what
his own
that.
podcast, like the Prof G podcast, and he speaks, I think, quite well for a lot of men that aren't the ugly side of like the Andrew Tates and all these guys, and he's trying to give a positive view. But even him, some data had come out that men are falling behind in X, Y, and Z, and his advice was, "Come on, men, we need to step up. We need to suck it up. We need to do like." And I think again, it speaks to your point that like this isn't something you can just turn on a dime. Like these are men that have been socialized since they were boys to not be a certain way. And so if we don't address the emotional component, I think men, they can't identify how they feel, which means they can't identify, in my opinion, they can't identify who they are, and they can't identify when something is negatively affecting them so they can make a change. So how do you expect all of these men in there, anywhere from 30s to 80s, to all of a sudden say, okay, I guess I can be different now, when you can't even identify that there's a problem, even if it's killing you inside? Like, does all of that seem accurate to you?
Absolutely, and your podcast, I think, hopefully will reach some men and help them to see that they were basically, uh, sold a bill of goods as boys that told them that the only way to be male in this society was to hew to these ridiculous standards and ignore, your humanity. So
Right.
hopefully it'll reach some men in that
Right.
in that way.
I think that's a sad, but I think quite a poignant place to end. So thank you very much for being here, and all of your work since the 80s. I didn't know it was that far back. Like I think you're one of the shoulders of giants that I think the rest of us can look to try to make ourselves better as we try to get older as humans.
Well, thank you, Michael, and it's been a real pleasure working with you and getting to know you, and I wish you the best with your work.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Take care.
So thanks for listening to No More, No Less. I appreciate the time you spent with me today. So please subscribe and rate the show if you enjoyed it. It'll help me create more amazing content and get that next little bit of validation that I so deeply crave. If you didn't enjoy it, well, that sucks. But to make sure, I think you should listen to my next 10 episodes and then decide. I mean, come on. Rome was not built in a day. I'm just getting warmed up here, guys. So thanks again. See you next time.